Another team that would love for the transfer portal to really help them out is Nebraska. Matt Rule takes over in Lincoln, and he brings a track record of development. He brings a track record of success from his time at Temple and then at Baylor. A brief stop in Charlotte as a Carolina Panthers head coach that obviously didn't work out. And he's back to the collegiate ranks. This is a team that has been well documented, their shortcomings, right? It hasn't worked for them over the last really since they left the Big 12 and went to the Big 10, right? Since what was that 2012? It's just kind of been a disaster. Scott Frost, that story did not work. And now you're set back kind of at square one after a 5-7 season. You're wondering who your quarterback is. You've got Casey Thompson coming back, but Jeff Sims has transferred up there to Lincoln. Can he wrestle the job away from Casey, who was rather uninspiring after he nearly won them that game over in Dublin? Um, where do you start if you're Nebraska? You've got great resources, you've got a great history, a great brand. What's the fix?
You got to know that Matt Rule is going to tear it down to the studs this year.
Yeah.
And I think he does have quarterback talent, which is different than any of his previous two collegiate stops. Temple and Baylor were just absolute messes when he got there. So that's why he tore it down to the complete studs. I don't know. It's going to be really interesting to see if Matt Rule looks at his roster and says, no, we can actually try to compete for a bowl game in
Yeah.
2023. And I don't have to do my shtick of tearing it all the way down to rebuild it and take, the old proverbial saying is take one step back in year one to take two steps forward in year two. It'll be interesting to see if Matt Rule goes back to that old MO. I think that he has a lot of talent on that roster. Scott Frost wasn't the best recruiter, but he got some talented guys in there through the
Hmm.
portal and through high school recruiting. If I'm Nebraska, what I am really going to focus on doing is using Matt Rule's connections that he built while at Baylor to go get some guys in the Lone Star State that are getting overlooked by A&M, getting overlooked by Texas, getting overlooked by Oklahoma and some of those bigger power programs in that area. Because just like we were talking about with Georgia, there's a plethora of guys in the state of Texas that can make an impact on your team just from a raw athleticism standpoint. So you might not be able to find your anchor to the offensive line for the next 4 years, but you can find a scat back, or you can find a slot receiver, you can find a burner on the outside, or a cover corner, or a safety, or a lot of skill position guys that can fill holes on your roster that you've desperately been trying to fill since they left the Big 12. And
Hmm.
those Texas inroads that they had in the Big 12 by playing 4 or 5 conference games here every year, since they left the Big 12, that just has not been the case. I don't have the stats
No.
in front of me, but Nebraska used to come in and cherry pick a few guys
Yeah.
from the state of Texas every single year that Texas and A&M really wanted, and they lost out on them to the Cornhuskers. So they can get back to that by starting with using those inroads that Matt Rule's already built,
Hmm.
kind of doing the Joey McGuire approach, right? Like Joey McGuire is not going after, he's getting 4-star guys, but he's not going after the top 5 prospects
Right.
full out in the state of Texas. Obviously, Joey McGuire would be ecstatic if one of those guys eventually chooses Texas Tech, but he's not worried about that right now. He's not putting all his eggs in
Hmm.
that recruiting basket, and he's trusting that the high school programs in this state, the high school development in this state is really elite, and he can get a lot of guys that can really help his program quickly, just by going after that next tier of guys. So that's what I'm doing if I'm Nebraska, and
Yeah.
I think those guys can do a number on the Big Ten West. Are they going to compete for a national championship right away? Probably not, without just an ecstatic quarterback, but they're definitely athletic enough to do some damage in the Big Ten West.
I agree. I think, I'm looking at their recruiting from this season, and the guys that came from the state of Texas, you've got an athlete and then defensive line prospects. And a couple of those were, decently regarded edge prospects. Riley Van Poppel, a guy that I actually remember walking around growing up while his dad was coaching our baseball team. He's committed to Nebraska, so it's funny to see. Little Riley is now 6'4", 270 pounds, and going to
Not
Nebraska
so
to play
little
edge.
anymore.
That's a shock to me, but yeah, they've you look at what they've done in the recruiting aspect. They get Malachi Coleman to stay home, a Lincoln kid who was committed to Nebraska and then watched everything burn to the ground this year and decommitted. And then when Rule was officially hired, recommitted. He's a freak of an athlete, right? Number 66 overall recruit, the second best athlete in the country according to 247. And then it's a lot of size and speed, guys that they want to develop, to build. And like you said, they're not necessarily trying to win in year one, although I've seen some of Big Red Nation drinking that Kool-Aid and thinking,
Yeah. Well,
we're back, baby. Uh
well,
give
because
it
look at their
give it a
schedule.
year.
They're never in the Big Ten West until the
I
Big
know.
Ten restructures their divisions. Every single year, we're going to have this conversation with Nebraska because
Yeah.
on paper, what we think of Nebraska should beat what we think of Purdue and what we think of Minnesota and what we think of, you know, some of these other Illinois. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, that hasn't played out. And obviously, Purdue, Minnesota, and Illinois are all light years away
Mhm.
ahead of where Nebraska was as a program under Scott Frost. But
Mhm.
on paper and from a perception standpoint, there's no reason that Nebraska shouldn't look at their schedule and think, okay, 8 wins is our floor every
Right.
single year.
Well, and to your point, I did this. I don't think it's going to have dropped yet by the time that you guys are listening to this, but our first 5 year plan is over Nebraska. And I outline a couple of things that I want to see changed under Matt Rule. One of those, win your conference games. Trey, to your point, last 5 years, Nebraska is 16-37 in the Big Ten. That is inexcusable when you play in the Big Ten West. I mean, you can understand maybe getting to that point if you're Maryland, right? Or Rutgers, and you're on the east side where you have to play Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, and Michigan State every single year. Like, there's just going to be years that you don't win any of those games. And you have to have an honest conversation with yourself and your program and look in the mirror and say, are we headed in the right direction? Are we building towards where we can beat those teams? But when you go 16-37 against the Big Ten West, I mean, not exclusively against the Big Ten West, but the majority of that is against the Big Ten West, the objectively weaker side of the conference. That's for me the first thing that has to turn around. The defense also has to be so much better. I mean, you think back to that Oklahoma game, and dude, they got run out of the building in their own stadium by a team that went 6-6 in the regular season. Like, you just couldn't keep up. For me, those are what Matt Rule has to do first and foremost as his tenure in Lincoln starts.
If I'm reading this correctly, and I might be reading this wrong, but I'm looking on 247, Nebraska's all time recruits. It looks like they haven't signed a 5-star prospect since the class of 2005.
Ooh,
So
okay.
that hasn't been the recipe for success. And, under Bo Pelini and under, before him, they weren't a laughing stock. They weren't winning, competing for national championships, but they were winning, 9, 10 games a year in the Big 12 when the Big
Yeah.
12 was a really, really strong conference. So they don't necessarily need to go after those elite guys. Obviously, as they're building their program perception, that can happen and that would be amazing, but they don't need those guys to be not a laughing stock.
Gracious him. How about